Welcome to Compelling Topics, the only channel dedicated to the perspective of leading researchers from the Italian independent scene. Let's turn your minds on. There is something deeply unsettling in the way contemporary cinema portrays rebellion. It is no longer just entertainment. It has become a language, a code, perhaps even a tool. Enrica Perucchietti and Roberto Quaglia guide us through a sharp and provocative analysis of two iconic films of modern culture, Joker and V for Vendetta. Through a perspective that goes beyond the surface of the narrative, the video explores how these works, seemingly revolutionary, may in fact turn into sophisticated mechanisms for neutralizing dissent. From the figure of the Joker, completely rewritten compared to the original, to V's mask, now a global symbol of protest, an uncomfortable question emerges. What if the system were capable of absorbing and emptying the very ideas that seem to threaten it? Enrica Perucchietti and Roberto Quaglia announce that in this episode they will be discussing not one, but two films. Before getting to V for Vendetta, however, Perucchietti wants to talk about a film she describes as genuinely good. Finally, she emphasizes, even if it is not without its Hollywood techniques. That film is Joker, directed by Todd Phillips in 2019, starring Joaquin Phoenix and Robert De Niro. Perucchietti introduces the plot. This Joker is very different from the classic comic book character, who is here completely transfigured. Todd Phillips' Joker is a mentally ill man, a social outcast, a true reject of society. The film's opening sequence makes this immediately clear. The protagonist's face is superimposed over news footage of a city in chaos, drowning in both literal and metaphorical garbage. Arthur Fleck lives with his elderly mother in a crumbling apartment block and scrapes by making street advertisements dressed as a clown, nurturing the dream of becoming a stand-up comedian. His life, however, is one continuous tragedy. He is ignored, trampled upon, bullied by everyone around him. He has developed a nervous tic that makes him burst into uncontrollable laughter at the most inappropriate moments, rendering him unsettling and pushing him further away from any possibility of social connection. One day Arthur reaches his breaking point and reacts with violent force, pulling out a gun. While the Gotham City police hunt down this killer clown, the population elevates him to the status of a metropolitan hero, a symbol of the uprising of the oppressed against the arrogance of the wealthy. Perucchietti acknowledges that the artistic result is remarkable. The screenplay is excellent and Joaquin Phoenix's performance is, in her view, exceptional. Nevertheless, she argues that the entire film ultimately reduces itself to a masterful mass cathartic ritual of oniric justice, a mechanism already seen in some form in Avatar, Elysium, and many other films. The difference here, she notes, is that the screenplay, production, acting, and cinematography are all genuinely of a high standard. Quaglia admits that it almost pains him to pick apart a good film. Finally, He says, "There is one worth discussing. Because since Barbie, there has been a relentless parade of products he would rather not comment on. There have been a few good films, like The Truman Show, but they are exceptions. That said, Quaglia considers Joker a film that is hard to attack, and for precisely that reason it deserves careful analysis." The first thing Quaglia notices is that the film steals a comic book character, Batman's Joker, and completely distorts his defining traits. Todd Phillips' Joker has nothing in common with the Joker from Batman, to the point where, according to Quaglia, there was little point in pretending otherwise. This constitutes, in his view, the first form of deception at work. A famous character is appropriated and utterly stripped of his original identity, for reasons that are clearly commercial. Claiming that this Joker is Batman's Joker generates far more audience interest up front than an entirely original character ever could. The second element Quaglia highlights is that the film is a colossal cathartic ritual of oniric justice, built upon the audience's identification with a mentally ill man. The paradox, he explains, is that the people watching this film are not remotely like its protagonist. They are not mentally ill outcasts. On the contrary, they are precisely the type of people Joker victimizes, the people he shoots, the ones he turns against, the television celebrities the protagonist kills throughout the film. This creates a paradox that is already embedded in the film itself. Joker's ideal victims celebrate Joker alongside the audience in the cinema. They are, in effect, celebrating one of their own executioners, or rather, identifying with him. Even though in real life it is the marginalized who are the victims of the masses, not the other way around. It is a mechanism similar, Quaglia says, to the one already seen in Avatar. In real life we belong to the unfeeling herd, but in the film we dream of rebelling against ourselves, identifying with the rebel. Perucchietti adds that Batman's Joker, up to and including the version played by Heath Ledger, who, despite the character's complexity, was still a somewhat more humanized figure in his madness, was fundamentally the trickster, the jester, the rogue who gradually develops a form of sadism. He is a villain beyond good and evil. Here, however, the character is completely inverted. He is the bullied, the persecuted, the victim who finally fights back, right up to the film's climactic scene in which he sets the city ablaze. Anyone who watches this film, says Perucchietti, especially those who saw it in cinemas, feels themselves to be a participant in an incendiary cathartic ritual. The inversion of the character is, in her view, an extremely significant element. At this point, the two hosts introduce the evening's second film, V for Vendetta, presented as yet another example of the familiar ritual of collective oniric justice. Here too, they note, we are dealing with a waking dream, and here too there are significant differences from the original source material, particularly from Alan Moore's graphic novel. Perucchietti presents the film's details, directed by James McTeague, released in 2005, starring Hugo Weaving, Natalie Portman, Stephen Fry, Stephen Ray, and John Hurt. She notes that the protagonist, played by Hugo Weaving, replaced James Purefoy, who had begun filming but found himself unable to sustain an entire performance while constantly wearing the mask and costume. The film was written and produced by the Wachowski brothers, later the Wachowski sisters, while McTeague had previously served as their assistant director, as well as assistant to George Lucas. The plot: in an imaginary future Britain governed by a totalitarian regime, a mysterious masked man who calls himself V declares war on the system. He is a radical anarchist determined to restore freedom and justice to a country now ruled by authoritarianism and intolerance toward anyone who refuses to conform. In the name of truth, V manages to convince the young Evie, played by Natalie Portman, whose life he saves at the beginning of the story, to fight alongside him. Quaglia begins with what he considers a fundamental point. Here too, the source material has been reworked in classic Wachowski fashion. It is said, he notes, that the Wachowski sisters personally directed certain sequences themselves, particularly the fight scenes, which clearly evoke Matrix. Their fingerprints are unmistakable. Quaglia then moves on to the differences between the film and Alan Moore's original graphic novel, published in 1982 and completed between 1982 and 1985. In the comic, the story is set in a radically different context. Africa no longer exists, having been destroyed in a nuclear war. Europe as we know it no longer exists either, and England, in the aftermath of the war, has seen the rise of a fascist dictatorship, explicitly named as such in the text. It is within this context that the story unfolds. One difference that Quaglia finds particularly interesting concerns the question of the epidemic. The film introduces a pandemic complete with quarantine measures. At the beginning of the story, moving around the city requires a kind of pass that is strongly reminiscent of the COVID Green Pass. This element, Quaglia notes, is far more prominent in the film than in the original graphic novel. The film was made in 2004, and at the time that kind of subject matter was far from commonplace. But what strikes him as even more significant is that the film explicitly portrays the epidemic as a false flag operation, one orchestrated by the government itself against its own population in order to seize power. This element does not exist in the comic. It was introduced into the film as a message between the lines for those with eyes to see. And it is precisely, Quaglia says, the kind of situation that would be lived out in a slightly different form 20 years later. The discussion then turns to other elements introduced in the film but absent from the graphic novel: retinal recognition as a tool of surveillance and control, and the issue of dissent being labeled as hate speech. The film was made in 2004, when branding dissent as hate speech was not yet the widespread refrain it has since become. Today, any statement that strays from the mainstream narrative risks being branded as hate speech and, in the future, may even be subject to legal prosecution. The film was therefore anticipating a dynamic that would only become reality much later. Another element introduced in the film and absent from the graphic novel, according to Quaglia, is the theme of altering the meaning of words as a tool for maintaining power, a clearly Orwellian dynamic. The film's overall framework is very Orwellian and, he adds, far more overtly politicized than the original graphic novel. At this point, Perucchietti opens a parenthesis dedicated to Alan Moore, the author of the graphic novel. Moore, she notes, refused to have his name included in the film's credits, and it is not the first time he has done so. Quaglia says he came to know Moore personally and believes that Moore probably read the book he wrote with Watson. He describes him as a truly unusual person, deeply interesting from many angles, and absolutely one of a kind, not least for his decision to refuse any association with the films adapted from his work. Moore is, Quaglia says, the first to reject the label of graphic novel for his own works. He makes comics, and he says so without hesitation. It is the humility of genius, Quaglia observes. Someone who knows perfectly well that the content speaks for itself regardless of the label has no need to dress it up with elaborate titles to inflate its perceived value. The fact that Moore refused credits for both V for Vendetta and Watchmen is, in Quaglia's view, a magnificent demonstration of dignity and integrity. And it is precisely this that makes the mechanism at work all the more striking. A work born from a genuinely anarchic mind like Moore's is used by the system to manipulate the public on a massive scale. To explain this mechanism, Quaglia invokes the French philosopher Jean Baudrillard, who wrote a book whose title encapsulates the idea that television has killed reality. Applying the same reasoning to cinema, Quaglia argues that a film about revolution kills revolution, just as a film about anarchy kills anarchy. In the same way, Joker, being a film about rebellion, kills rebellion. The manipulation at work here, he says, is extraordinarily sophisticated. The moment the idea of revolution is transposed into the illusory bubble of cinematic representation, attention is shifted onto the idea itself, draining it of reality. The viewer enjoys the film while dreaming of a revolution that, at that point, no longer needs to be carried out. Just as in Joker one dreams of a rebellion one will never actually undertake. V for Vendetta in the original representation of Moore's graphic novel, is an artistic, anarchic dream, rich in poetry. Transposed into the Wachowskis' cinematic format, it becomes instead, according to Quaglia, a vaccination against revolution itself. The would-be revolutionary ends up believing that all it takes to make a revolution is to buy a carnival mask, V's mask, and put it on. At that point, the revolution happens automatically. That mask stands in relation to revolution, Quaglia says by way of metaphor, as a holy picture of Jesus Christ stands in relation to spirituality. Baudrillard was already present in Matrix. In one of the film's early sequences, his book can be seen on the shelf in Neo's room. The Wachowski brothers, later sisters, explained that they had drawn inspiration from Baudrillard. The philosopher himself, in an interview, commented on Matrix, saying that the first film engaged meaningfully with his theories, but that the subsequent chapters completely betrayed the spirit of his thought. Baudrillard did not live to see the fourth installment, but it is well known that he was far from satisfied with the direction the series took after the first film. Quaglia argues that the Wachowskis carried out a very similar operation with both Matrix and V for Vendetta. They began with outstanding source material. In the case of Matrix, Baudrillard. In the case of V for Vendetta, Moore's poetic and anarchic graphic novel, and managed to funnel it onto the tracks of Hollywood convention, while presenting themselves as misunderstood visionary geniuses. Quaglia says he finds the Wachowskis deeply irritating and considers them among the most overrated directors in the history of cinema. Even in V for Vendetta, which is not theirs as directors, but is nonetheless written and produced by them, their mark is clearly visible throughout, including in what he describes as an underlying vulgarity and tendency toward excess. The process is exactly the same one used with Matrix, except that there Baudrillard was present to lend intellectual nobility to the product, whereas here it is Moore who plays that role. Nevertheless, Quaglia leaves open a possibility. Perhaps the Wachowskis also intended to send a signal between the lines, introducing Baudrillard's book and consciously applying his thinking. The point is that if television kills reality, then a film about revolution kills revolution, and the Wachowskis may have applied this principle in a state of complete and deliberate bad faith. One does not need to have read Baudrillard to arrive at this conclusion, Quaglia says. Baudrillard is simply the thinker who best managed to articulate the full picture of the processes at work in our minds. Quaglia himself admits to having written, long before encountering Baudrillard, a short essay in the early 1990s titled Television, The Modern Religion, a trifle compared to Baudrillard, he says modestly, but one that shows the intuition was already in the air. The substance was clear. The empirical evidence suggested that things stood exactly as he described. Baudrillard was brilliant at putting it into words, but he is not the only one to have grasped the lesson. Those who use these mental processes to deceive the public understand them perfectly well and apply them to shape the social mood of entire populations on a global scale, sometimes for decades. Matrix and V for Vendetta continue to exert their influence to this day. The Hollywood system, Quaglia concludes, colonizes even the narrative of dissidence and revolution. Those who dream of making a revolution end up doing nothing more than putting on V's mask and reciting, remember the 5th of November. It becomes almost a parody. Perucchietti adds that the film's best moments, upon closer inspection, are all present in the graphic novel as well, stolen, in other words, from Moore's poetry, with nothing original contributed by the screenwriters. Quaglia agrees. He recognizes certain elements of the film as interesting, but he was put off by the vulgarity that surfaces from the very beginning. The cinematography, the Italian dubbing, which he describes as atrocious, but even the original language version has something garish about it. There are more poetic and romantic elements, and a structure that nods toward the Count of Monte Cristo, which he finds appealing. But everything that ennobles the film comes from Moore, while the rest bears unmistakably the Wachowskis' signature. Perucchietti wants to close by highlighting an element that matters particularly to her. With V for Vendetta, the same thing happens as with Matrix. Especially within circles of dissent, these two films are treated as the twin banners of revolution, rebellion, and resistance. without any awareness that they have not only stolen a certain kind of language and narrative, but have actively imposed it on the very world of resistance itself. Those who use them as symbols fail to see all the mechanisms that have been deployed to defuse dissent itself. It is, she says, as if they were suffering from a form of Stockholm Syndrome. Quaglia clarifies that for Stockholm Syndrome to apply, one would need to know who one's captor is, and in this case the captor has hidden itself well. And yet, he says, it does not take much reflection to recognize that Hollywood is your captor. One simply needs to take that one extra step. And besides, he adds, it is clear that this is ultimately one great trap, which does not mean one cannot enjoy the film, even multiple times. He himself has watched it more than once, because he found it genuinely engaging. It was only later, when he read the graphic novel, which he did after having already seen the film, that he discovered all the most poetic aspects of the film were present in an even richer form in the original, as, he says, one might have expected. Quaglia concludes by saying that, for the sake of consistency, if anyone were to draw inspiration for their revolutionary impulses from somewhere, they should draw it from the comic, from the original, from the work of a genuine anarchist. Anarchy is a dream, he says, in the sense that it is difficult to realize in the real world, though one can remain young at heart for an entire lifetime, and the important thing is to recognize that it is more fantasy than plan. In this case, however, that fantasy is exploited by the film to round up the herd of black sheep and steer even them onto the tracks of a narrative written by someone else entirely. Perucchietti finally recalls that the director McTeague is the same one who made Invasion, and Quaglia cannot help but note the coincidence. Both in Invasion, which is adapted from Invasion of the Body Snatchers, a film that already existed in 2 or 3 earlier versions, and in V for Vendetta, the same director introduced the theme of pandemics and epidemics into contexts where it had no place in the original source material. The same director introduces pandemics into 2 separate films where they were entirely absent from the works being adapted. As Andreotti used to say, Quaglia concludes, thinking the worst of people may be a sin, but more often than not, you turn out to be right. That's all for today. See you in the next episode of Hollywoodism, Movies and Propaganda, here on Compelling Topics.
I went